Now let's talk about standalone mode versus domain mode. Standalone mode is essentially much the same as it was in EAP 5. In essence, it is a single JBoss EAP instance running on its own Java virtual machine, typically on its own piece of hardware. It's configured and managed independently. Applications are deployed to it and managed independently, although it's still possible to coordinate a group of independent instances such that they provide a clustered environment. But the only way you can manage standalone mode EAP instances as a group is with perhaps a tool like JBoss Operations Network. Domain mode, on the other hand, is new to EAP 6. Domain mode, in essence, is a mechanism that allows us to define a group of EAP instances that are managed as a group. For this to happen, there will be a domain controller, which is a process that runs often on a server instance of its own, a piece of hardware of its own. It's certainly a process that runs within its own Java virtual machine. The domain controller is in essence the master for the domain. It's responsible for coordinating the actions of the host controllers, which in turn are responsible for coordinating the individual server instances. Typically, a host controller will reside on an individual piece of hardware. It too is a process that runs inside its own Java virtual machine, and it may be responsible for starting and managing the lifecycle and deployments, etc., of one or more JBoss EAP server instances. For all intents and purposes, the host controller and domain controller are essentially the same process. However, the domain controller is a specialized instance of a host controller. It has the additional responsibilities of managing the domain. Host controllers are only responsible for managing individual EAP server instances. A domain may make it easier to create a cluster, but as already mentioned, at the end of the day, EAP instances running in a domain are equally as proficient and have the same number of services as a standalone instance of EAP. They're identical in terms of what they can offer. Just a word of warning, if you are planning on managing your environment with our JBoss Operations Network tool, domain mode is currently not supported with JBoss Operations Network. You will have to configure your environment to use standalone instances. Okay, that's our discussion on standalone versus domain mode. So if you're running a domain mode environment, you may be interested to know the distinction between the host and the server. The host controller is the controller that the domain controller talks to. Domain controllers do not talk directly to server instances, they talk via a host controller. Generally speaking, there will be one host controller per machine, and the host controller will be responsible for starting and or stopping and managing things like deployments on one or more EAP server instances running on that same machine. So the host controller is the administration agent on the machine, acting as a proxy to the domain controller.